Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 p.m. My name is Edil Sepulveda. I am the applications coordinator for NASA Carbon Monitoring System. So we'll start today's CMS Policy Speaker Series from July 2021. I'll give a brief welcome, introduce today's speaker, and also give some announcements on the CMS initiative. And while we do that, we'll be getting more people to join, and then we'll go to today's presentation. So first, I'm just going to share my screen for some slides. Okay, so you can see the slides. Today's talk is titled "Show Me the Data." Complementary satellites are providing global transparency in methane emissions now. And today's speaker is Stefan Germain, that is the founder and CEO of Greenhouse Gas Sat. Before moving to the talk, I would just like to remind you that you can visit our website, that is carbon.nasa.gov, for more information on the recently funded CMS projects, the data products that we have archived and available to be used by stakeholders, our upcoming events, and other stakeholder engagement efforts. Here, I just wanted to take the opportunity, since we're going to be talking about some products that can be used for methane emissions and also for CO2 emissions monitoring. Just take the opportunity to highlight some of the data products that we already have archived and available, have been funded through CMS, that are related to methanes. So we have several CMS projects that work on data products for methane monitoring, and some of them we see here. Riley Duran CMS 2015 project on the prototype methane monitoring system for California. There are several data products that are archived at the Oak Ridge National Lab, DAC. And then Daniel Jacob from Harvard University, who Stefan has been engaged in his work. He has several projects from 2014 that you can see here, 2016, and now a new project in 2020. And for those, he has developed different data products that this one that you see here, like methane flux for Canadian oil and gas systems. Also, you can find there methane flux for Mexico and United States oil and gas systems, and also global methane fluxes optimized with GOSA data from 2010 to 2018. And you can find those archived at JustDisk. Or for more information, you can go to our website, carbon.nasa.gov. There is a section of CMS project profiles where you can see all of the data products that are being in development or are archived or are available for the use. I also just wanted to mention that in the website you can find more information, as I mentioned, about the CMS funded projects and the data products. We are planning some surveys, workshops, and data tutorials for stakeholders. And we will also be revamping a CMS stakeholder working group to discuss CMS science and applications updates. And you can find all of that information on the website. If you have any recommendations on speakers or topics you would like to see in future Policy Speaker Series seminars, or any suggestions about activities or events that you would like to see from our site, please reach out to my email. You can see there the email, edil.sepulvedacarlo@nasa.gov. I also wanted to mention, we just got 17 new projects that were funded. The information on those projects is now available on the website. And you can see here on the left-hand side, teams and projects section, you can find more information about the new projects there. Also, you can see save the date, the CMS Science Team meeting and the applications workshop is going to happen November 16 to the 18th. We will be in the next, I imagine, couple of weeks giving more details about it, if it is going to be in person in Denver or if it is going to be virtual or a hybrid. So be in the lookout. And then, as a reminder, we have an ongoing call for papers for a special issue of the journal Environmental Research Letters with a focus on carbon monitoring research and applications. The call is staying open until the end of this year, December 31. So if you're planning to draft a paper related to carbon monitoring or any of the topics you see there, among them biomass, atmospheric flux quantification, uncertainty quantification, user applications, and stakeholder needs, please consider this a special issue. So now I would like to introduce the speaker, Stefan Germain. He's joining us from Montreal in Canada. Stefan is the founder and the chief executive officer of Greenhouse Gas SAT, whose technology provides actionable greenhouse gas emissions data and insights to various industries. He will be discussing how different satellites are being used together to provide persistent monitoring of methane emissions worldwide. I just wanted to mention that we will have, after his presentation, we will have at least 20 minutes for a Q&A and discussion session. So feel free to start posting your questions on the chat box, or you will have an opportunity to ask the question directly at the Q&A session. So I'm just going to come here and stop sharing, and then just give the floor to Stefan. Stefan.
All right, thank you, Adil. Much appreciated, and thank you all for attending today. It's my pleasure to speak with you today. And certainly for us, as an opening statement, we are very closely involved with the European Space Agency. We would very much like to become more closely involved with NASA and with the broader international community. And so this is for us a great opportunity to update you on not just what we're doing, but what we're doing together with others to help monitor the planet for methane emissions. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And with that, I'll dive right in. So first, I also want to acknowledge that I'm following a theme that was set by Kate Larson in a talk at the CMS Speaker Series here in May. She had presented a policy talk around the concept of show me the data. And I wanted to continue on that because that's very much what we do. We're all about measurements and providing data to industrial operators, to governments, to financial analysts, and other stakeholders to help them better understand, control, and reduce emissions. So with that, I'll dive right in. And I'll start with an optimistic slide. I'm an optimist by nature, and I thought we should maybe start by pointing out the things that seem to be going in the right direction with regards to climate change. And that's really the continuing and growing engagement of, as I said on here, public markets, companies, investors, and governments towards decarbonization. There's just been an ongoing acceleration over the last few years, and most recently towards pushes for net zero commitments, both from governments and industry, and of course, significant policy moves in the United States, in Europe, and China that I remain optimistic are going to move us in the right direction. That being said, as the saying goes, trust but verify. Really, it's great to be optimistic, but we really need to measure and measure more, and then provide a degree of transparency in those measurements for everybody in the world to understand what's going on, and apply those measurements to verifying inventories, finding point source leaks, and ultimately measuring our progress towards various targets that have been set either corporately or nationally or internationally. So today there are many satellites that have been deployed historically, and there are several now in orbit that are monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, of course. We have added 3 of our own satellites that we have in orbit now that are collecting information on methane in particular. And when we combine our data with third-party data, it allows us to come up with something like what you see on this slide here. which is a global map of methane in the world, methane concentrations. It's updated on a weekly basis, and it's a rolling monthly average of concentrations updated on a weekly basis on a 2x2 kilometer grid worldwide. And it is really there not to be a scientific resource, but more to be a discussion piece to raise awareness with the general public and with our commercial customers, to have them, question, why is there a hotspot over the San Joaquin Valley in California? Why is Northern Africa persistently red? Why is there a hotspot over Bangladesh? And those kind of conversations then lead them to ask us questions about, can you see more high resolution versions of that? Can you find out what the individual sources are of that data? And that ultimately leads to better understanding and ultimately, we hope, action in reducing emissions. So that's why we generated Pulse and why we maintain it, is we've had it online for over a year now. We will continue to maintain it because it's a great way to start the conversation, to continue the conversation. Now let's dive in a bit more into methane monitoring satellites and the ones that are used on a regular basis today for monitoring methane around the world. And I'll start by talking about two types of satellites first. One category that I've called global mappers, and another one that I've called regional mappers. So the global mappers are really designed to see the whole planet as frequently as possible on a near daily basis. And they're designed to inform climate models and advance science. So as many people on the call here will appreciate, in order to get global coverage, there's a trade-off on both sensitivity and on spatial resolution. And so what you'll see is that while these are great for mapping global concentrations, they aren't necessarily as useful for detecting individual point sources. You can only really see huge ones. And they're not great for identifying individual sources because they have to have very large pixels. So regional mappers take this down a level in terms of detection threshold and spatial resolution, and these are designed for looking at the Permian Basin, for example, which is a stated objective of Methane Sat, which is a satellite to be launched in the next year or so. And so these now generally designed, again, to advance science, but also to inform policy, not specifically designed really for point source detection, but they can be used that way. So as an example of that, here's an example of Sentinel-5P, or TRPOMI, on the left, where there's a series of measurements taking over Florida. And within those, there is a hotspot, actually a plume, leading to a projected source somewhere in north central Florida. And we then used Sentinel-2 data, because our own satellites weren't covering that area at that particular time. We used Sentinel-2 data now to go in with a much higher spatial resolution, down to about 12 meters, I believe. And the Sentinel-2 had enough sensitivity to be able to pick out the plume of methane coming from a source, which turned out to be a midstream oil and gas facility that was having a blowdown on that particular day, releasing some methane, and released a whole lot of it. And that became the subject of an article in Bloomberg and caught the attention of the EPA and state regulators. So, this is an example of how two satellites can be used together. The global mapper, Sentinel-5P, that on a coarse basis can see a plume and suggest a hotspot, and Sentinel-2 can then go in and measure more precisely exactly where the source is. So that leads me to talk about a third class of methane monitoring satellite that's out there today, and that's facility monitors. So satellites that are specifically designed to detect individual sources and ultimately provide actionable information to commercial customers. And that's exactly what we do, what my company, GHGSat, does every day. So we designed our satellites, again, as a trade-off. We wanted to be able to detect individual sources right down to individual oil wells. and do that with a very low detection threshold, so the lowest detection threshold available in the world today. And we wanted to do it from a very small satellite in order to be able to do this as a cost-effective commercial service for these commercial customers. So our satellites are about 15 kilograms, so they're about 25 by 25 by 40 centimeters, so size of a microwave oven or so. And that makes them small enough, cheap enough that we can offer compelling pricing for our services while still detecting small emissions with a very high spatial resolution to attribute the emissions to specific sources. So again, in the spirit of trade-offs, they can't cover the whole world every day. They operate in a snapshot mode. They don't operate in a push broom mode, and they can only take snapshots because they've got limited memory capacity on board. They operate in a store and forward configuration. They can only measure tens of sites per day per satellite, and that's obviously very different than covering the whole world every day, like Sentinel-5P does. But that then leads to thoughts of, why can we work these satellites together to harness the strengths of each of them to complement each other? And that's in effect exactly what we do. So the first example of that is work we've been doing with Tropomi, Sentinel-5P. We've been doing that since 2019. So we use Sentinel-5P for a few different reasons, but primarily we use Sentinel-5P to tip and queue our own satellites. So we look for hotspots around the world with Sentinel-5P, and we actually work very closely with the science team from Sentinel-5P at Esron in the Netherlands. And every few weeks we get together, we review a list of potential targets, and then we agree on which ones we'll prioritize, and we task GHGSat satellites to go take a look at hotspots that have been identified, but not necessarily pinpointed by Tropomi hotspots. And in that way, we found almost 100 persistent sources, but we found hundreds of plumes from those almost 100 persistent sources identified worldwide over the last 2 years or so. And the first examples of those were published in a peer-reviewed paper in 2019 with Daniel Varon from Professor Jacobs' group at Harvard. And this was is the discovery of really, really large point sources that exist in Central Asia. And that was really, really successful in a number of ways. One is that we really demonstrated the cooperative arrangement of how we can use a large public satellite to support tipping and queuing of small private satellites. But also we found and were able through, believe it or not, concerted diplomatic action. It took several ambassadors over several months to get just one leak shut down for over a year that represented about 5 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. One leak in Central Asia. So that was, a heck of a way to start a collaboration, and we hope, a sign of good and better things to come. So just to give you a bit of a fly through of a few examples of what we can do with GHGSat satellites. So again, these are designed now for identifying individual point sources, and they're operating now. There's 3 satellites in orbit. We have our demonstration satellite and 2 commercial satellites. So what you're looking at here is the Permian Basin, and you're seeing several different facilities in the left-hand panel, where every one of those squares you see on there and the lines between the squares are various forms of oil and gas facilities, whether they be individual well pads or midstream facilities or pipelines. And obviously what you see overlaid in the middle is methane concentrations, where red is higher concentrations and blue and green are lower. And you can see that the wind is blowing from the east on that particular day towards the west, and therefore you get this plume shape from, when you zoom in on the right-hand panel, very clearly attributed to a specific industrial facility. And that's really important in the Permian Basin because, believe it or not, adjacent pads and adjacent infrastructures can be owned by different operators. So there might actually be 5 or 6 different operators just within the 4 by 4 kilometer field of view that you see on the left-hand panel. So getting the right operator attributing to the right source is really important, which is exactly why we designed our instruments to do what they do. You can also apply the same idea to coal mining. So different set of challenges technically from operating instruments in space for monitoring methane. So in this case, you're looking at Poland and coal mine emissions from Poland. You're looking at a background that includes water, includes different albedo backgrounds. In this case, there's actually 5 different sources in the same field of view. That one of the sources in the middle is actually 2 separate sources. And we can attribute those back to individual coal mine vents. We have enough spatial resolution to be able to see exactly where those emissions came from. So in this case, this is both commercially and scientifically valuable because commercially, we can obviously work with the operators to track their emissions and help them put in place mitigations that they can then see the impact of those mitigations. But scientifically, the magnitude of these emissions are large enough that it can actually contribute to the Eastern European modeling of total fluxes on a regional level. So we're working with scientific teams in the Netherlands to improve their models based on this data. One more example, and this one's a little closer to home. This is a landfill in California. To be more precise, it's the Sacramento landfill. And so you can see methane emissions from, in this case, what looks to be not the active phase, but actually probably part of the gas collection system that's leaking. So we contacted the Sacramento Landfill Authority that is aware of this, and they're aware of the emissions magnitudes that we saw. And they, of course, are inspecting the landfill as a result. So we see this in not too many places, fortunately, in North America, but we see it all over the rest of the world. So places like Bangladesh that I mentioned earlier, India, Latin America, Central America. The emissions from landfills where there are no gas collection systems can be very, very large and persistent. Okay, so changing gears a little bit. It's great, we've got a lot of data, a lot of measurements, but how can we sustain that and bring it together on a global basis? So I hope I've demonstrated to you that we can use complementary satellites with complementary performance to achieve different results. And now there's many different ways of funding that kind of activity. So on this slide, that I pointed out private investment, public investment, philanthropy. So we are an example of a methane monitoring system that is privately funded. And there are others that want to do the same. And of course, that relies on there being a commercial market because we need to be able to sell our services so we can generate enough revenue to then reinvest in the system, build more satellites, and advance the technology. Public investment, well, of course, has always been the backbone of climate research, and many would argue that all greenhouse gas data should be a public good. And we would actually, believe it or not, subscribe to that as well, and I'll explain that in a second. But that's why, and why in the past and hopefully in the future, investments will continue to be made by national agencies like NASA, of course, and NOAA to really understand greenhouse gas emissions and fluxes in the atmosphere. But of course, you're joined by other agencies like ESA, JAXA, DLR, and so on. And more recently, there's been another financing model that's come along. It's really philanthropically driven. So this has been an interesting development. It started with the Environmental Defense Fund that set up Methane Sat that they'll be launching again within the next year or so. And there's going to be a set of free data available, and apparently some data that might also be available for a fee under a license in order to pay the operating costs for the satellite. So that kind of model of the hybrid of private and philanthropic model is new and is we'll see how well it works. There's another philanthropic model that has recently been announced as well, actually coming out of NASA JPL, and that's Carbon Mapper. So it's Planet working with JPL to take the Avarice NG that I believe was shown on an earlier slide, take that technology and miniaturize it for use in space. And so that's a highly anticipated mission. I think it should be very successful, a very qualified team behind it. And this would be a good example of how public investment working together with philanthropy can make data available for GHG monitoring. So if you take all three of those with different models, different motivations, different profit motives or no profit motives, how do you bring them all together? Well, there's an initiative right now undertaken by the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. It's called the IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And that's one example. There undoubtedly will be others over time. But how you can take data at different scales and bring them together to then have a curated data set that can be made available globally for free to be used by scientists and by government agencies to understand and track inventories around the world on a fair and transparent basis. So we can contribute to that, and philanthropic missions can contribute to that, and public investment missions can contribute to that through various forms of licenses. And so these are tried and true methods that allow us to both generate commercial revenue from our satellites and contribute to the public good all at the same time. So, in order for that to work for us, we need to make commercial revenues. And so in this slide, I try to summarize very briefly why people might want to pay for greenhouse gas data. First and foremost, because methane, we're focusing on methane first, methane has value. It is the primary constituent in natural gas, which has a tradable value in the market. There is a revenue imperative for operators not to just vent it. They'd rather be selling it where they can. So rather than venting money to the atmosphere, they should capture it and sell it. There's increasing investor pressure and regulatory pressure, of course. And finally, there's also health and safety motivations. So the image you see on the left here is from Tianjin in China, where we found a rather large leak in early May. And I'm happy to say that within a day of this being detected, we were able to contact the operator, and the operator was able to get this shut down. But the international community tends to react very well and quickly to threats and dangers to human health and safety, and that in itself is a motivator, often even for a commercial business case. So governments and analysts, of course, are also motivated to buy data for various reasons, and we aim to serve all these different markets commercially. And in order to do that, and I spoke to it earlier, we've deliberately designed our system to have the lowest possible detection threshold, so we can see as many sources as possible, and to attribute them as clearly as possible with as little false attribution as possible. And so what you see on the left is a chart that illustrates the various emission rates of the sources we found in a 3-month period in early January of this year. And the statistics generally work out to about 70% of the total emissions we detect with GHGSat are below the detection thresholds of public satellites. So again, that speaks to complementarity. And the attribution is illustrated by the image you see on the right, which is again in the Permian Basin, and every one of those white dots and white lines is some sort of oil and gas facility, probably owned in this case by dozens of different companies. And we are able to identify very specifically the well pad that's leaking in the middle and use third-party databases to identify the owner of that facility, contact them, and let them know about the leak so they can fix it. In order to provide affordable services, as I said earlier as well, we need to do that with a satellite that is small and cheap enough that we can justify a return on investment to our investors, and be able to sell services at an attractive price and generate that return on investment. So you see an image of one of our satellites in its separation mechanism here. This was before our Falcon 9 launch in January of 2021. And as I said, we launched our demonstration satellite over 5 years ago now. Still operating. It had a 3 to 5 year lifetime, and it's now exceeded the outer bounds of that. So we're very pleased with our demonstration satellite. And our 2 new satellites are operating with approximately 10 times better performance, lower detection threshold than our demonstration satellite. And we've just closed another round of venture financing to allow us to build a total of 10 commercial satellites. So the next launches are scheduled for next summer, again on another Falcon 9. and then in winter 2023 and summer 2023. And also, just to again emphasize the point, it's really important from a commercial service point of view to be able to offer reliable information to our customers. So that attribution has to be correct. So it applies not only when we're using our own satellite data, but also when we're using complementary satellites. So in this case, this is another example of using Tropomi, which is Sentinel-5P. You see some measurements from Tropomi on a wider scale on the left and zoomed in on the right. And the yellow pixels you see in the middle are higher concentrations of methane. And so there's been a bit of a fashion here in the last few months of putting out press releases and sending articles to the media about these nasty leaks all over the place. There was an article, in fact, published about this particular leak, which is a blowdown of a section of midstream pipe. And the source of the information for Bloomberg, who wrote the article, reported that the facility that was responsible for the emission was marked by the pin here called Tropomi Guess. As it turns out, they were 30 kilometers off. It was a completely different facility. And we identified that using another part of the satellite, not our own. And that different facility, then we contacted the operator, and we wound up getting the contract for persistent monitoring of their facilities because we were able to demonstrate that it wasn't what was reported in the media. Nevertheless, there's some value, of course, to raising awareness in the media. But if you're going to do that, get it right, because you're going to wind up shaming the wrong people, and at the end of the day, that's going to have negative consequences all around. So the getting data right, attributing sources to the right sources using multiple different satellites with different resolutions, different scales, is really important if you want to offer commercial services. So I'll end on this slide, which is a very qualitative roadmap for how satellites can work together. And I think we're well along the way of the various steps proposed in this roadmap. First, it's really important that we keep working to lower the detection thresholds to the smallest possible level. So we are providing the state of the art today at about 100 kilograms an hour, and we've actually exceeded that. We've gone below that number, but that's our publicly reported number. Today also we're achieving 25 meter resolution. That is also state of the art combined with that 100 kilogram per hour threshold. Today we're already, as I showed you, demonstrating how various satellites can work with each other to tip and cue each other or to identify sources together. What needs to improve from here is not the detection threshold, it's not the spatial resolution. It's really about coverage, largely in order to help differentiate intermittent versus persistent sources, because that's really important for being able to provide actionable information for the people who run and operate those sources. Also, we think it's really important, and that's why we want to contribute to the IMEO, the International Methane Emissions Observatory, that there be global models. Now, we're building our own, by the way. We're not going to wait for the IMEO. But if there are multiple different sources at different length scales, it's a beast of a problem to be able to bring these together in a scientifically rigorous way. So fortunately, there's a lot of really big brains working on that. Like I said, we work with some colleagues at Harvard, but obviously there's lots of others that are working that problem, and we're very open to collaboration on that. Then, as I said, also we need to keep working on reliability. Attributing to the wrong sources is just a bad idea. Certainly quoting uncertainty in measurements is important. Not everybody's doing that in this world right now, and certainly scientists are, but on a commercial level, there's a lot of numbers being thrown around a little haphazardly right now. So let's throw some rigor in there and make sure that uncertainties are quoted. And finally, I think it's very important, it always has been, certainly from space, to verify and validate across systems in order to be able to demonstrate consistent insights and build trust in the measurements and inventories that are generated from satellites. So, I throw in a little quip there that should be less focused on the headlines and more on the quality. Hopefully, this is largely an audience of scientists and policymakers. I think this group can appreciate the merits and the value of that. So that's all I had for slides for today. I think I've left, about the right amount of time for some Q&A. So I don't know how you want to do this. Should I just pause there and let you be master of ceremonies?
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. We can go to some questions. People can also, I'm going to give some time for people that want to unmute themselves and ask the questions or comments directly to Stefan. We already have one question on the chat from Jennifer Des Moines. How do you account for the movement spread of methane plumes, and is tracking methane plumes useful? For example, for health air quality impacts over large areas.
Okay, so our field of view is about 12 kilometers by 12 kilometers, and we take our snapshot over a period of 20 seconds. So there will be some movement in the plume, of course, even in 20 seconds. But since our pixel resolution is 25 meters, the movement will be very small over that period of time. So generally, the plume is reasonably stable over that time scale and over that length scale. And that's what allows us to get a reasonably good estimate of the emission rate at the source based on the plume sheet. Hopefully that answers that one.
Yep. And Maruthi asks, what do you think is the best way to reconcile between land-based, airplane-based detection and satellite-based measurements?
Wow. There's no easy answer to that one. So what there's a real problem with full physics types of approaches to reconciling those three different length scales. For example, having a 7-kilometer pixel from Tropomi and trying to inform a higher concentration you may see in that pixel from a point source measurement from a ground-based detector at an oil well, it's going to be virtually impossible to reconcile those two data points in a scientifically rigorous way. So having an airplane base will give you something in between the two. So our belief is that while we need to keep working on that, and certainly if you collect more data, if you have millions of ground-based data points in an area that has a statistically significant number of large pixels, then perhaps you can reconcile the two to come up with a rigorous model. But it's going to take way more data than what's available on the ground or from the air right now. So our belief is it's going to take a different approach. I don't want to, unveil our approach just yet. When we do, don't worry, it'll be published. But we believe there are some methods for doing that. It's just we're going to need to come at it from a different way than just a classical full physics approach. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. We now have a couple of more questions regarding detection. There is a question from Michael Wright and one from Junji Liu. So does the resolution allow detection of small fugitive emissions from, for example, abandoned gas wells? And can the greenhouse gas satellite attribute high methane concentrations over northern Africa to specific sources?
Okay, so one is kind of a geographic coverage question, and the other one's more of a detection threshold question. So let's start with the abandoned wells. So we continue to push down the detection threshold to see smaller and smaller sources. Individual abandoned wells, we cannot see. Every study I have seen indicates that the emission rates from abandoned wells are going to be lower than our detection threshold. And by the way, a little plug for MethaneSat. This is where a regional mapper like MethaneSat really shines. Whereas it's not specifically designed to measure large individual emissions. It is designed to measure total fluctuations in the emissions of a region like the Permian Basin, capturing everything: individual sources, that you can see and individual sources that you can't see, but aggregate into a total increase or decrease in emissions from the region. So whereas you won't be able to pick out each individual abandoned well, you will see the total contribution of all the abandoned wells combined with the active wells in the region to see how it makes the emissions fluctuate. So that's probably as good as I can answer that question. With regards to regional coverage, we absolutely monitor North Africa. We absolutely measure, the satellites are in a polar sun-synchronous orbit, so they can see the whole world. Not every day. Our revisit for any point for each satellite is approximately 2 weeks. That's dictated by the swath and by the pointing ability of the system. But anyway, so with 3 satellites, we can revisit approximately every, let's say, 5 days for sake of argument. And with 10 satellites, we'll be able to revisit approximately every day anywhere on the planet. And that's whether it's North Africa or Saudi Arabia or Central Asia or Asia or Australia, we're measuring them all right now, literally right now.
Great. I'm gonna take one more question here. We have several, but then give some opportunity for some of the people that are present if they want to directly make questions or just some comments. So Sean Herbath mentions he doesn't know if he missed this, but how do you approach quantifying uncertainty in your observations?
So let's start with the detection. So the raw measurement of our satellites is moles per meter squared per pixel. And so there's an uncertainty measurement related to the retrieval of the concentration per pixel. And so the uncertainty is really just is a product of that retrieval process. So in every retrieval, we generate the what we call an abundance data set. The abundance data set includes the concentration estimate per pixel, the error in that concentration estimate per pixel. It includes methane, of course. It includes the albedo per pixel. All of those are simultaneously retrieved. And at that spatial resolution, winds up giving you both a pseudo-visual map as well as an overlay of concentrations, as well as the uncertainty. So that's at the retrieval level and the concentrations, or the moles per meter squared per pixel. Then the uncertainty in the estimated emission rate is a whole other animal. If you want to get an estimate of what the emission rate was coming from that oil well that you saw that plume coming from, you now have to take into account wind speed, wind direction uncertainty, and those wind up being the dominating uncertainties in any estimate of source rate. So for that, we use a published method. It is actually pioneered out of JPL. It's integrated mass enhancement. And I'd invite you to go take a look at the published papers on that. And they speak to both the measurement and the uncertainties from those methods. So I should probably leave it there because that could be a longer answer.
Thank you, Stefan. So if there is anyone that wants, I don't see any raised hands, but if there is anyone that wants to make a question, comment now. You have time.
Adil, may I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Bob Cormia in Northern California. Thank you. My question, and you may have asked it already, is are you able to create a time-integrated inventory of how much methane is produced for a given flux? I apologize if I missed this. I think you said it was a big beast to monitor all of these plumes, measure all the methane, and then create a summation of all the methane emitted. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I can answer that on a couple of different levels. So first of all, to answer for an individual plume, it's the integrated mass enhancement method I just referred to, and there's published methods for that, and that's what we use today. We also have other techniques that we use to compare with those, but anyway, on a plume by plume basis, I think that's a reasonable answer. Where the big beast is combining satellite measurement with ground measurement with aircraft measurement at different scales, so different pixel sizes, different time scales, different timing, not just time scales, but timing of measurements, and trying from those direct measurements to get an inventory estimate, for example, for emissions from the Permian Basin. That's hard, and there are teams working on that right now. as that's where I was referring to full physics models before, trying to constrain the degrees of freedom of those multiple different inputs in ways that make physical sense to arrive at an emission estimate for a region or for a country. So some of that work has been done, and there's been papers published on how you can do sort of a mass balance, simplified mass balance method to see, over time, by looking at, upwind and downwind from a region, the concentrations, how you might, from multiple different measurements over time, arrive at a mass balance that gives you an emission over time from that region. That's somewhat simplified, but really there's interest in getting much more elaborate. I'm not sure I'd call it elegant, but certainly more elaborate than that with full physics models that take all those different inputs to arrive at an estimate for the whole region. So I mentioned also that we are working on a different method that's coming at it, a little orthogonal to the typical full physics approach that we hope will do a better job of integrating these disparate data sources to get to this, holy grail of inventories per region, and ultimately have inventories for every country in the world to help, better inform not just concentrations but emissions worldwide. But it's a lot to bite off. But got to be ambitious.
Right. No, thank you. That answers it perfectly.
Thank you, Robert. Anyone else that have any questions, comments that they want to make directly to Stefan? Okay, we still have more than 10 minutes, so we can go to some of the questions in the chat. So Benita asks, do you have a mechanism to detect disastrous events such as oil, gas leaks versus emissions on the regular basis?
Yeah, so we have, we're routinely monitoring everywhere we look every day. It's not the whole world, but we are large parts of the world, and we have alerts. So we have an alert system whereby, certainly for our customers, they come first. If we see a leak from one of our customer facilities, and they will be advised as quickly as we can, typically within 48 hours, and we're trying to get it faster than that. But with a store and forward system, you can imagine that there's some inherent delays in the way that works that makes 48 hours even a challenge sometimes. We will also alert, obviously, for any human health issues that we see. So the example I showed in Tianjin in China was a great example. Fortunately, we don't see a lot of those, but when we do, we'll absolutely, move heaven and earth to advise the local regulator and or the operator of the site to make sure that those issues are addressed. But that's as far as it goes right now.
Okay, and Ann Johnson, I saw your previous question, and just to make sure, we're gonna post the slides and the recording of the talk on the CMS website, just to be sure with Stefan. This is a specific one about educators. Can educator use the slides for remote sensing? I imagine it's education purposes.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, be more than happy to. These are all approved for public use, so please feel free to use them as you feel appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Karen Jones, talking more about applications and engaging with decision-making agencies, have you have any discussions regarding how EPA and other environmental regulatory organizations can recognize satellite imagery as best available technology?
Yeah, so we have had long-standing discussions with the California Air Resources Board. They are very well informed on satellite imaging. I guess the proximity to JPL helps, and so they've been avid users of Avaris NG and for aircraft surveys. In fact, if you go to the CARB, California Air Resources Board website, and in particular to, I think it's AB 1496, if you want to Google that one, you'll see a number of data sets that are available publicly from their campaigns. So they're very well informed, and they espouse an approach of what they call a tiered monitoring system, where they want to use satellites on a regular basis at a low cost to monitor the entire state. They then want to do periodic aircraft surveys of areas of higher concern, and then finally have permanent ground monitors at areas that are particularly sensitive, where they know they've got persistent emissions and that they want to have a better quantification of emissions. So they use those different tiers as well as mobile and other sources of measurements to really characterize what's going on in the state. So I'd say CARB is by far and away, from what we've seen anyways, the most educated, if I can put it that way, user of satellite data. EPA is more open to satellite measurements in the last few months, shall we say. And so I think there's been a renewed effort now to introduce satellite measurements and the possibilities of satellite measurements to the EPA. And I think there's active interest there now. That being said, the existing regulations that are in place don't recognize satellite measurements as a method by which to monitor methane emissions across oil and gas, for example. There's only handheld ground-based measurements techniques that are approved. So there's an effort, ongoing effort, not just from us but others, to have not just satellite but also aircraft measurement techniques recognized as alternatives. So I'd say that the EPA is coming from further behind, but there's a new openness there now to consider it.
Thank you. And a couple of questions from Ana Prados. And I think you mentioned this, but just to go over this quickly to clarify, what is the spatial coverage and the temporal resolution of your satellite? And then also, what type of data do you provide for customers? Is it concentrations, fluxes, or both?
Okay, so each field of view, so we take snapshots, and each snapshot is 12 by 12 kilometers. And within that, each of our pixels is 25 meters by 25 meters. So that's what we measure, and each one of the measurements in each one of the pixels is a concentration expressed in moles per meter squared. So that is the raw measurement from our satellite. We deliver what we call an abundance data set. So that is level 2 data product effectively, which is like I said, concentrations, moles per meter squared per pixel, the error in that measurement and that retrieval of mole per meter squared per pixel, and the albedo in each one of those pixels as well. And that's delivered as an array, as a set, as a geotiff. And then we also, yes, provide, if we see a plume, because we don't always see a plume in each field of view, we will deliver a source rate estimate for any plume that we see. And that source rate estimate is generated using these integrated mass enhancement methods, the IME, that again is published material on that. In terms of temporal resolution of the measurements, each one of our satellites, so we have 3 in orbit right now. We're going to launch another 3 next summer, and we're going to have a total of 10 by the end of 2023. Each one of our satellites has a 14-day revisit for any 12 by 12 kilometer field of view, but not every 12 by 12 kilometer grid point on the surface of the Earth, because we don't have enough capacity to do that. But for selected ones, we can go revisit every 2 weeks for each satellite. So hopefully that answers that question.
Perfect. Thank you. We still have 7 minutes, and we have several questions still to go, but I want to give, if there is anyone else now that wants to also make their questions directly to Stefan. Or just let me know and you can raise your hand. We still have several minutes. But we have very good questions here still, like Robert Cormia asks, can a satellite be part over the Arctic to look at a sudden release of methane from the Siberian ice shelf?
So no and no. So the satellites are in a low Earth orbit and then in the sun-synchronous orbit. So they're traveling at 7 kilometers per second, and I guess you could put one in a Molniya orbit, which is a possibility. and in that way you could kind of have a near geo type of behavior over a pole. But even if we did that, let me get to the second no, which is that the system is really, our satellites are optimized for detecting industrial scale emissions from point sources or near point sources, like what you see on the screen right now, which is a landfill. To us, this is, a potentially a 1 by 1 kilometer source or so. And so, when you look at melting permafrost, that is very small emissions per unit area that turn out to be a very large emission over a large area. But we're really not designed to look at those kind of variations in large area fluxes. So, unfortunately, that's the second no.
Does the sensitivity of the system pick up leaks from the pipelines?
Yes, they do. Absolutely. So any emission that comes from, again, an industrial scale, 100 kilograms an hour or more right now, we're working to reduce that detection threshold. No matter what that facility, we can detect it. So right now, by the way, I didn't talk about this, but we're focusing on onshore measurements because we use light reflected from the surface of the Earth. We have a passive optical instrument that relies on sunlight in order to make a measurement. So we're operating the shortwave infrared. So we need the reflected shortwave infrared light from the surface of the Earth in order to make a measurement. Shortwave infrared over water really sucks because water absorbs shortwave infrared light unless you're operating at a glint angle. So here we're taking lessons from NASA and ESA where you've demonstrated glint before. And we just announced a couple of weeks ago that we're going to do a project for looking at offshore oil wells or platforms to see if we can detect glint using glint mode measurements over water. So for now, we're just focused on land, and we're focused on land in daylight, which also has implications on seasonality in northern latitudes. But that's one constraint. We're looking to expand that over water as well. And while I'm diverging a little bit, let me also point out that the instrument on board is really just effectively a really high spectral resolution hyperspectral imager. It's got a spectral resolution on order of 100 picometers or so, and so that it's designed to pick out individual transitions, very narrow transitions from absorption lines from gas molecules. And that means while we're tuned for methane and we can also do carbon dioxide, we can also look at other gases. So there's been interest in sulfur dioxide, there's been interest in air quality gases, so sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, nitrogen dioxide, we are interested in those. We really just have to prove out the commercial business case on each one so that we can finance the instrument. But in each case, we're talking about single millions. We're not talking about a $100 million development effort. So I digressed a bit. There's an extended answer for you.
Thank you. Daniel Cunningham asks, what are the challenges to improve the 100 kilogram methane per hour sensitivity and its payload for the smaller satellites limitation?
Yeah, so great question. So as in all things for a space instrument, there's a bazillion trade-offs. So yes, certainly jamming the instrument in a small satellite creates some optical limitations. So if we could create a faster optical system, that would help. Right now we're pretty good. We're between 1 and 2 F number, but we would love to get down closer to 1. The other thing is the size of the aperture. So right now we're constrained by the small sat face that we're using. But if we could have a larger aperture, again, that's more light and more signal. So, a bigger bus would provide both of those. The other thing a bigger bus would provide is more power so that we could look at a cooling system that would allow us to have a different detector on board. Right now we're using a passively cooled in-gas detector. So if we went to something that was a bit more exotic that required active cooling, that we could do with a bigger bus. And also more power would allow us to have more memory and or more processing power on board. and possibly inter-satellite links that would allow us to have faster communications as well. So there's all kinds of fun stuff we can do. I love this stuff, but but right now we have to, live within the means that we have and generate a return on investment with what we have.
Thank you. It is 1 p.m. We have, I think, two more questions. I'm going to ask you the one question that I see here from Mark James Shopping. He also had some comments. Are your instruments always viewing at nadir, and could they exploit viewing obliquely?
So they're optimally designed for nadir, yes. However, they do point off at a cross-track angle as well. So typically we operate up to 20 degrees cross-track. And when we do glint angle measurements over water, again, that's usually no more than 20 degrees, but it's in that range. It's 10 to 30 degrees or so. So yes, we can operate cross-track. It creates opportunities for faster revisits and, when there's an urgent source for us to monitor.
Okay, so I think that's the time that we have. I want to thank you again, Stefan, for your time in presenting today. Also, like for everyone who joined, we have almost 100 people. Thank you also for your time. We're gonna be posting this on the website of NASA CMS, carbon.nasa.gov, in the coming days, and you can write to me. I put my email here, and if you want to reach out also to Stefan, I can put you in contact. Stefan, I'm gonna make you send you the chat from the meeting, because there were some comments also there that we didn't get to address. So hopefully, we will continue this series and be in the lookout. We'll continue with the talks in the coming months, and then we have the science team meeting and the stakeholder workshop in November, and AEU in December. So just go to carbon.nasa.gov for more information. Thank you all again. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Edel. That was great. Have a great rest of the day.